Chapter 2. In the weeks that followed, word of the expedition spread throughout Mexico, and it was decided by the viceroy that the expedition commence on the following Sunday. With the money Coronado gave me, I bought myself a horse and a new shirt. I had plenty of money left over to buy other things, but I knew I had to save whatever I had left as long as I possibly could. In the meantime, I remained by Coronado's side and tried to be his friend. I ate meals with him often and spent time with his family. At first, I was treated cordially, but as time went on, I knew I'd outworn my welcome. Oftentimes, Coronado asked me to leave his presence, and I gave him as much distance as he pleased. We headed north to Conquistadors soon after Marcos had testified. The town of less than 200 suddenly exploded into a population of 2,000. Many men came from Mexico City. Some came all the way from Spain. Most of these men were not soldiers. They were businessmen, and they rode into town on their gallant horses. One evening I was invited to attend a dinner, which Coronado called a captain's meeting. We stayed at the viceroy's house and dined on roasted lamb and sweet wine. There were 10 men, including myself. And at the beginning of the meal, Coronado pronounced us to be promoted captains. Coronado had informed me only hours before, and although I thought the gesture was kind, I did not think it was deserved. Coronado in particular had a queer air about him that night. I studied his diction, especially when he talked to the men. He seemed too diplomatic. He acted haltingly and chose his words carefully. His pronunciation and enunciation seemed elegant on the surface, but I felt, as did others, that he tried too hard, and everything that came out from his mouth seemed vapid and empty. In contrast to Coronado, the viceroy seemed to be the life of the affair, and thank God he was. He seemed the most relaxed of all, relaxed and assured. His face beamed bright, and his jokes and sly remarks filled the men with comfort and ease. And if it were not for his occasionally bawdy and outrageous antics, the evening would have been intolerable. As we waited for the lamb, the men hesitantly conversed with each other. I tried my best to be cordial. I introduced myself to the other captains, but after a while, I might as well have been invisible. I studied the other captains. They wore expensive clothes, and being men of nobility, they immediately and boastfully claimed from what province of Spain they hailed from, and why their land superseded all in the kingdom. Most of them came directly from Seville, Castile, or Leon, and it seemed that all of them had previously known each other from previous campaigns or engagements. Much like Coronado, they were rich. Old Spain rich. They wore rich clothes and behaved standoffishly. I hated all of them. Many times I just hated looking at their faces. In particular, I hated Castañeda and Cardenas the most. They seemed to be twins. And the more I heard them talk, the more I could discern that they were assholes amongst assholes. I concluded that they both came from a rare breed of asshole that stemmed from Judas Iscariot himself. Don't ask me how I knew these things. I just did. To my amazement, there was another man worthy of equal contempt. We haven't spoken a word to each other, but I hated him right away. He gave me an arrogant stare, and I darted the stare right back at him. I stared at his fat, ugly face for a long minute, as he did to me. He seemed too clean. He seemed too confident and sure. If I could get away with it, I'd slash his face with my knife the second I got close enough. He certainly looked like a bleeder. His name was Santaniello. Coronado deemed him second in command. Our eyes clashed again. I restrained myself and offered a fraudulent smile. Santaniello did not return. So those were our captains. They were the most arrogant, incompetent, and contemptible bunch of men I had ever come across. They were dreadful and unbelievable. They wouldn't survive 2 months in the jungle, let alone the desert. They were too used to living in a world that made sense. And I wouldn't trust them to find a sunset. The only saving grace was one man named Tovar. He was the only man who impressed me. And the look on his face, that look of dejection and absolute disdain, was one I found welcoming. I came to know that he was one of Cortez's men. He at least was a soldier, and by the looks of him, he looked like a damn good one. Though we didn't speak much to each other, we shared mutual respect and understanding, and most of the time, we merely nodded to each other. About 10 minutes had passed. The servants entered the room and placed the lamb on the table. It was brown and crisp, and the outside skin sizzled, casting about in swirls of steam. The meat was rare and it stuck to my teeth. The sound of smacks and slurps filled the air, and the men ate like pigs. When supper had ended, the scribes entered the room and laid out the very long document on the table. As the captains approached the table, the viceroy read the letter, and when he finished, he asked each captain to stand. "Captains," said the viceroy, "may God bless us and keep us." Coronado was the first to sign. Then he called the men and asked them to step forward. The men approached the table, signed the sheepskin, and returned to their chairs. I was the last to sign, and when I returned to my chair, the viceroy stood up and raised his chalice. Then the Sunday came. At sunrise, I saw a priest and monks scattered about the chapel. Outside, I saw Fray Marcos and Brother Luis by the statue of St. Matthew. They kneeled and prayed for about an hour. Then the bells chimed in fanciful striking chords, and the monks entered into the chapel. I sauntered through the courtyard, made my way down the church garden, and glared once more at my would-be companions. Though Compostela was much larger than Galicia, it felt rather the same on a Sunday morning. It felt peaceful, plain, boring, and dull. I couldn't stand it, so I walked to clear my mind. I noticed more people gathered in the garden, and I saw many of the men and their families eating their breakfast under the shade of olive trees. A wedding reception was held right before the noonday mass. Among the smiling gay faces were musicians and alike, dignitaries, scribes, children, maids, noblemen, and archdukes. I knew none of them, and I stood in the back of the chapel and watched. The guests were dressed in white, and most of them were very young. The young ladies smiled and held flowers. I presumed they were bridesmaids. I stood frozen, as if I were a mute. The women were pretty, no doubt. At least some were. I tried my best to strike eye contact and catch the prettiest ones off guard, but my advances went nowhere. I kept my head down, greeting those I knew. I stared at the stained glass windows of saints and angels and looked for a seat. I found an empty spot on the second to the last pew on the right-hand side. I sat and looked back as more and more people entered the chapel. Half of the church had already been filled by then. I stared at the decor of the church and its architecture. Certain smells of Spain drew me back. I smelled the women's perfume and the incense and the holy water, and I delved into the memories of my youth. I looked all over the chapel and studied its stained glass windows, and I thought about all the times I stared at windows like these when I was a child and had a brick in my filthy little hands. I stared at the Stations of the Cross. Then the old Latin took over, and again I was transported back and lost all sense of time. I went back in my mind, back to when all this made sense. I couldn't remember the last time I entered a chapel. It must have been 10 years ago, during my father's funeral. I remembered my last confession. How much time had passed, how much I had forgotten, how much I had remembered. I simply did not know. I knelt down and tried to pray. I thought of my father and prayed for his soul. I prayed that he'd somehow find his way toward heaven, but I knew he deserved much more. I prayed for my mother and hoped that she was still alive, as well as my 2 younger brothers, whom I barely knew. Later, I prayed for guidance that this would be my last expedition, and that I returned to Spain as a noble and respected man. I did not pray for gold or my acquisition of it. My younger self would have, and would have died just to see half of what I saw in Peru. But in truth, my younger self died a crueler death in that jungle. And my present self was very aware of that fact. Last, I prayed that I'd survive. But when I finished my prayers, I remained sad and confused. I knew most of what I said was in vain, and quite simply, I did not know what to believe in anymore. The Mass began. Marcos and the other priests turned their back and greeted the altar, and together the congregation prayed to the Lord our God. I studied Fray Marcos. Rather, I studied the back of his head. I watched him approach the steps, bend over, and kiss the altar. He looked assured. His face concentrated on the ceiling, whereas the other priest and friar shared the same blank expression. But still for me, Fray Marcos remained a very queer man. Everything about him was strange. When he walked, he waddled to and fro. He was short and his eyes were gray and hollow. His breath smelled like rancid meat, and whenever he spoke, he made sure he'd stand very close to you. But with all those superficialities aside, I can attest that he truly believed that he was performing godly deeds. Yet with all that said, I still did not know what to make of him. The last bell chimed. I stood and saw Coronado sit with his family in the first pew. I exited through the church and saw the crowd of men gather for inspection. I looked at the men. There were 300 in all, and 200 other native allies. The would-be saints, the would-be devils of the desert. They all stood in line, and they all grinned like damn fools. I stared at the other captains, the bastards I met the night before, and I noticed that they were all suited in armor and wore bright red plumes upon their helmets. They rode on silver and gold-plated stallions, and as expected, none of them had approached me. All except Tovar, who simply shook my hand and wished me good luck. As with the captains, there was a great class divide, even with the men. There were wealthy men, and then there were men who could barely afford the charter. I noticed, too, that there were several women in the expedition, acting like business liaisons to their husbands. They were quite beautiful, reserved, yet graceful and kind. I knew they would be a distraction, so instead, I looked over to the many caravans. As we assembled, the scribes went to work. They documented everything, from the inventory of names to the belongings of each member of the expedition. They calculated all the thousands of pounds of swords and armor, the helmets and lances, the daggers, the wool and timber, pots and pans and clay trinkets, and hundreds of bundles of other garments. And by the pages they filled, it seemed as if we had brought all of Spain with us. Nevertheless, they went on calculating. However, what I noticed most of all were the jugs and jugs of wine that seemingly every man possessed. And I knew every one of them would be necessary. I looked to the desert and the land ahead. My gaze ended abruptly, and I was smacked on the arm. I looked to see who it was. It was Coronado. He smiled and climbed back on his horse. "Let's go, Sardina." I mounted my horse and followed him to the edge of the line. I was greeted by a scribe. Then a dozen men approached me and stood. "These are your men, Captain Sardina," said the scribe. I looked down to see what hand I had been dealt. From my first glance, I could tell something was wrong about these men, and I assumed that's why I was assigned to them. They were the youngest and poorest men in the whole expedition. Only one other man had a horse. Most of them had a glazed, blank look about them, with seemingly not a thought in the world. However, they possessed a hungry, rough demeanor. They looked raw, deviant, and embarrassing in almost every sense of the word. But I knew why they were called to join. All of them looked healthy and strong. I felt glad about them, though. I almost felt proud. They were thieves and miscreants. They were misfits and bullies. Thoughts raced in my mind. I wondered how they managed to pay for their charter, who they stole from, who they killed or kidnapped. All had their stories. I wouldn't doubt any of them, and I asked no questions. I wanted to smirk, but I remained in full grimace. I would know all their names later, but I knew now was not the time. I was told by Coronado never to befriend any of them, and I understood that principle and respected it fully. I merely introduced myself as their captain, gave them a glare, and kept my distance. Afterward, I ordered the men forward with the other units, and half an hour later, Coronado and the Viceroy held their final preambles and read out loud from scrolls. Coronado's speech languished for nearly 10 minutes. He listed all that was required, and the men jeered silently. They stared at his bright red plume and his shiny red helmet. They stared at his shiny young face, and they could not refrain from speaking their minds. "Who is this bastard?" "That's the governor." Coronado continued. "There shall be no blasphemy, no swearing, none shall be tolerated." "He looks like a pussy." "I bet he never worked a goddamn day in his life." Coronado continued. "We are assembled here on this day by His Majesty King Charles to find the 7 cities of gold. The first of these cities is Cibola. I expect 3 things: gold, God, and a lot of sweat. I expect you to expect the same. We ought to." This man is pathetic. He has no character. "That he doesn't. I knew his father, rotten thief. Look at him on his horse. He probably stole that horse." "Does this speech ever end?" "I'll bet you 5 ducats that it doesn't." "You're on." Coronado concluded. "We will be led by Friar Marcos. He has seen what we can only dream of, and he will lead us there." And as Coronado finally ended his speech, the viceroy patted him on the shoulder, pulled up his horse, and shouted to us all, "And under no circumstance shall you waste ammunition. Any of you idiots waste ammunition, may God have mercy on your stupid souls." Then the viceroy lifted his arms, pointed east, and shouted again, "Cibola!" And all of us cheered back, "Cibola!" The men beamed with thrill. Their eyes glistened. The expedition had finally begun. And off we marched. Before the Spanish named him the Turk, before he guided them to Cuevera, the spirit roamed the land for many lifetimes and came in many forms. He came as the wind that rustled amongst the prairie. He came as a bird. He was a magnificent broad blackbird, and he hung through the desert and thrived on the dead. And as a shaman, the spirit took form of a man and guided and protected the Pawnee from the evil spirits that cursed and blackened the earth. The Turk looks on through twilight. As the sun emerges, the Turk flies once again as a bird and swoops and searches the land west and south. Through the pueblos, he dances and patrols. He reaches a narrow stretch of valley, and in the bright morning, he finds the Spanish. The horrid and vengeful spirits. The spirits of the damned. He notices that their faces are red and burnt. Some ride on their horses and slump over in the heat. Others walk on foot, dragging in delirium. At night, their eyes flash and glow yellow. The closer he looks, the more the Turk knows he had seen them before, in visions and past lives. They were the same spirits. They were the same demons. The land remains. The Turk opens his eyes and becomes a man again. There would be no other way. In the desert, the Turk stands west and stares outward through the mountains. Sweat pours from his brow down to his chin. He stands erect and walks in long, prideful strides. His appearance is tall and gaunt. His smile is grand and damning, and he wears a coon hat that covers most of his scars. As the sun approaches his zenith, he meditates and closes his eyes. Then he stares back to the canyons, where he came across the monks and the slave. He inhales the air and sighs through his nostrils. He picks up a skull. He knows his mission. He is to be the demon's guide. They would arrive their own time. The Spanish rode forth. The land went ahead. For the first 3 days, Marcos rode on his donkey and kept close to Coronado, who strutted through the sand on his white Arabian stallion. Marcos's brown robes were drenched in sweat from top to bottom. His oily face seemed to burst out in pus. His whole face turned red and purple, and his bald head was a permanent, shining light. Coronado asked his questions, and Marcos answered them, though they were banal and asinine. And although he knew most answers, Coronado inquired Marcos daily, and Marcos returned with verbatim responses. Friar, about how far did you say the river was from the first city? 13 leagues. The silver mines you said you saw. It was north, Governor. Ah, yes, north. Any of this look familiar? All of it, General. Tell me, Marcos, how many times have you said Mass? I don't know, General. Thousands, perhaps. I haven't kept track. Today's was most beautiful. Marcos paused. General, may I ask? Yes, Marcos. What will we do with the natives? Coronado turned away. The natives? What shall we do with them? Oh, said Coronado. I suppose if they guide us towards gold, we'll guide them towards God. I'll leave that up to you, Fray Marcos. So we rode north. On many days, the sun emerged red and blinding, and the sky held blue. Some days the wind blew in. Some days there was no wind at all. But for the most part, the sun dictated everything. And when the dust settled and the night crept in, all went black and crisp and even. And the stars again blistered through the sky and shone brightly like diamonds. The men themselves seemed to be in high spirit, and I assumed they would be. We were finally on the move, and the sight of all the men traveling out stirred an excitement, and a great sense of confidence followed us. Days passed, not many, but I started to lose count. The further east we went, the closer we came to the mountains. Seldom time storms had emerged, but when they did, the wind switched, and for long minutes we felt the cold and heavy rain. But oftentimes the storms had passed over and missed us completely. I must confess, I fell in love with the desert quite quickly. It was the exact opposite of the jungle. I could breathe in it. Its warmth was healing. Its air was dry and satisfying, and its sky was almost always blue and clean. And for the first 2 days, I felt extreme satisfaction. I felt a feeling of great peace and content. I felt so because there was a strange sense of beauty to the land. There were sprawling dead trees, and the brushes and bevies of cacti went on and on. The sands were endless, and vegetation seemed less and less the further we trekked. But still, I felt a sense of richness to its sparseness and lack of care, and when we rested, I could feel it most. The mountains west had disappeared. I stared at the rocks and the white boulders, and I wondered why God had abandoned them. Beyond the cliffs, I watched wolves and mountain lions stalk their prey, and at night, I heard them prowl. The antelope and deer and the big horned sheep fluttered in the distance, but we mostly saw snakes, spiders, and rats below. They appeared as frequently as we made prints in the hot sand. But, unlike in Peru, they did not dangle over our heads. Rather, they slithered and hopped and scoured upon the surface. But the most particular creatures of all were the enormous enchanted black birds of the sky. One day I saw a particular bird at least a dozen times. Its wingspan was enormous. Its face was white and red, and its beak was long and contoured. It was an ugly bird. It was old and ancient. It flew boldly and swooped down low, and we watched it feast on the carcass of a dead antelope. Many of the men wanted to shoot it, but I ordered them not to. It's a bad omen to shoot birds, I said. I looked at the bird again. It looked beautiful to me. It was an ugly sort of beautiful, I'll admit. Nonetheless, I wanted it to live. As time went on, I finally knew each man in my unit. There were the Diaz brothers, the greatest butchers in all the world. There was Julio, a young blacksmith apprentice. Garcia, the wagon man. Antonio, Vargas, Gomez, and Charlando, all drifters and presumed vagabonds or sons of farmers. And then, of course, there was Bernardo Caballero. He was the only other man who rode a horse. He was a bastard, young and annoying, and he desperately wanted to be my friend. In the nearby carriage, I saw the women of the expedition. They sat and talked as a trail of dust emerged from beneath the carriage's wheels. All the women wore pretty white and black dresses. Their raven-colored hair was locked securely from underneath their headdresses, and I smiled at them whenever I had the chance. Of all the women, I desired only three. Francisca, the quick-witted wife of Perez, Maria, the wife of Juan de Paldinas, and Orchanga, the beautiful and reserved wife of Bernardo. Yet, I knew I could not let these distractions deter me, and for the time being, I focused on disciplining the men and occupying them with simple orders. We gathered wood for the night's fire, then we scouted the territory back a mile south to report on the terrain. My men proved to be respectful and resourceful, and to my surprise, for the first 2 weeks, they showed no signs of fatigue. The Diaz brothers were the prime examples. There were 3 of them. I always had great respect for butchers. Not admiration, but respect. Because I found that butchers always carried the sharpest knives, and they always smiled, whether in sun or rain or snow. At every hour, the Diaz brothers worked, and I took great joy in watching them. They worked with great efficiency and saved every part of the animal, sparing nothing to waste. I watched the blood squirt out, both thin and thick, and I heard the heifers scream as their hooves plopped to the ground. In Peru, there were mainly llamas to butcher, but here in the desert, there were steer, oxen, goats, and lambs, all of which we brought from Galicia. It seemed plenty at the time, and the general rationale was that our rations would last us 3 months. But for the time being, we were fed and happy. Around 1,000 Indian allies trekked alongside us. They outnumbered the entire army triple-fold, and for the most part they kept to themselves. In passing, I remember eavesdropping on a conversation between 2 captains, and I replayed their words in my mind. "These guys will show us," said one captain. "We're lucky to have them." "Do you trust them?" said the other captain. "I generally do." "Why?" "They love us." "Love us? Why? What did we do?" "We killed the Aztecs. They know they'd be dead without us. They're just repaying back what they owe. They're good people." Another day arrived. By noon, the guides told us there was a valley north that was littered with deer and other beasts. However, the further north we trekked, the less and less we saw. "Good-for-nothing bastards," I heard the men sigh. It was a frequent refrain. For the rest of the day, I said no other words to any of the men. I just wanted to forget the whole thing ever happened. Often, nights were challenging. I found it difficult to sleep many nights. Too many men were wide awake, and too much talk went about their mouths. They whispered to each other and gazed into the night sky, and often they would ask me questions. One man proved to be the master of such inquiry, and that was Bernardo. He was tall and lean. His shoulders were narrow, and like a child, each night he asked me a ceaseless barrage of questions. And like a concerned parent, I answered the ones I could and ignored all the rest. "Captain Sardina?" "Yes, Bernardo." "Aren't you hot?" "No." "No? How do you keep cool in this heat? I am boiling." "I don't mind it. That's how." "I wish I had your patience, Captain. I really do. This heat, it's overwhelming. I'm just not used to it. It must be colder in the mountains, no?" "You would think. That's not always the case." "Does it get hotter?" "Yes, sometimes it does." Bernardo was a fool, but in some strange way I knew it wasn't entirely his fault. He was quite rich, and he acted like a fool because no one told him otherwise. I felt pity for him, for he was fragile, pale, and reactionary. And I knew that if I stared long enough into his eyes, that it would break him. If I had the chance, and I knew I could get away with it, I would have killed him many times over, either in his sleep or in broad daylight. Why he was assigned to me was anyone's guess. I concluded that it was some sort of cruel punishment that was certainly unforeseen and unwarranted. And if I had the time, I'd certainly inquire upon what sin I had committed, It might have been just a joke, and if indeed that were the case, it was certainly a cruel one. I heard you played chess, Captain Sardina. Is that true? Asked Bernardo. No, I have no interest. But I've heard you were a great player. Where have you heard these things? A little bird told me. You're a man of fortune, Captain Sardina, so I hear. From whom do you hear these things? From people. People? Various ones. Word gets around, you know. No kidding. Tell me about Peru. Tell me your story. You'll have to pay me first. And, to my amazement, Bernardo retreated back to his horse, returned, and handed me a small sack of gold. And with reluctance, I relayed him my story of Peru, or at least what I remembered. I told him an abridged version of the story. It took me 2 nights to tell it, but Bernardo remained unsatisfied. He wanted me to repeat the story, and he bribed me with another sack of gold. But by then, all the money in the world couldn't make me tell it again. More nights passed. I heard coyotes yip and scuttle in the darkness. Bernardo stayed by the carriage and consulted with his wife. Then one night, Julio rested by my side. We talked about obvious things, but I noticed there was an eagerness in his eyes, a want. I have a feeling, Captain, said Julio. What kind of feeling is it, good or bad? Good. It's a good feeling. I waited for him to go, but he remained lost in thought. Well, what do you feel, Julio? I feel we're close. I looked back at him and sighed. Keep that feeling, Julio. Keep it with you at all times. Less than a month had passed. We were still very much in the dream. Bernardo decided that Brother Luis was to join our unit for moral clarity, as he called it. I held no objections. Unlike Marcos, Luis did not possess a mule. He walked on foot, and for many days and miles, he remained alone. He was not a very tall man, nor was he as short and stout as Marcos. He kept to himself most of the time. He always greeted me with a gracious nod. Other than Marcos, Luis was the only witness to the miracle. And being so, my men badgered him with questions. They asked him many times what he had seen. Naturally, Bernardo led the conference. Many others followed. They asked him about the cities. But, unlike Marcos, Luis made his claims in a calm, dignified manner. How many of them did you see, brother? From a distance, I saw all 7. Truly? God as my witness. These cities are wide and grand. What riches did you see? Gold and silver, rubies and pearls, sapphire and emeralds. These cities, though, they must be enormous. They are. Do each of them have a gate? Some, I can't remember. Some have arches. What color are these arches? Silver and gold. Are you sure there's 7 cities, brother? Yes, there are 7. There might be more. More? There might be. I can't be certain. What do you remember the most? The glow. The glow? When the gates opened, I saw a glow. It was a light from heaven. Was it God? Did you see God? It certainly looked like him. How close are we? Still far away, son. How far? Very far. How far is very far? This is the devil's land, son. It never ends. And it didn't. The land never stopped. It turned humid and the sky filled with clouds. We heard cracks of thunder and many strikes of lightning. Yet there wasn't a drop of rain. We stepped higher into elevation and saw cliffs that stretched further north, and the air got thinner. Being that Luis was our guide and light, I was glad he was only a man. If he was a deity of some sort, he would not have been believable. It was clear, though, that there was something heavy racing about his mind. At times he looked lost and bewildered. There was something engraved in his eyes and face. And after a week or so, I concluded what it was. It was sadness. It was a pain and a grief that I fully understood. We were both empty as the desert we stood on. Luis was a man who could have been my brother in a different life. He was like me. His mind was filled with guilt and sorrow, and I could tell all these things just by staring into his eyes. They were sad, preposterous gray eyes. It was never said, rather, it was felt. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Luis seemed to be a version of myself had I gone to the seminary. Had I not gone to Peru, had I stayed in Spain and did as my father requested of me, I would have been a priest. Just looking at Luis, I knew certain things about him. I knew that he accepted a bale of nonsense that he could not question, and I knew that nonsense would carry him through his dying day. Yet, if there was one man who could ever make me return to God, it was Luis. But, to my delight, he did not try. Instead, he left most things to silence. We shared quiet moments and stared to the stars and sunsets. He never asked me about Peru, and I never asked him about God. Those questions would come at their own time. But what I remember most about Luis was his singing. He held a high tenor, and he sang for hours at a time. The Dies Irae, the Salve Regina, and many other hymns I did not know. The Latin was long, beautiful, dark, and haunting. The army approached a small river west amongst the basin. Coronado kept in quiet meditation and requested to be alone. He stared beyond the river and the desert. The sky was overcast and gray, and what little light shone came in slivers and pockets. Coronado approached a clear spot of the water and stared at his own reflection. He stayed only for a minute, but in that minute, he thought of many things. He thought of Beatrice and his daughters. He thought of the viceroy and the correspondence to the crown, and he thought of his grand return to Compostela. Although he knew the men needed rest, Coronado's main intention was to rendezvous with his navy just south of the river. However, the rendezvous did not go as planned. There were no signs of any ship north or south. As the minute ended, he looked once more at his face from the reflection of the water. His hair and beard felt full and heavy. His eyes remained green, but he found his skin decisively burnt and red. Yet, he felt blessed. There was a confidence on his face. There was an assurance. He felt as though he were one of the Magi, entering into Bethlehem. He knew something that the world had not, and by knowing such a blessed thing, he knew that he could save the world. He took a sip of water and held it in his mouth for a minute. Then he spat it out in disgust. Not long after, Castaneda approached him. "How long will we rest, General?" 3 days. No more, no less," said Coronado. "Do you think we're close to the city, sir?" "We're closer than we were yesterday, no?" "Yes, but according to Fray Marco's account, the river is well beyond where we are now." "So it is. There's much desert, General. Much more than we realize." "We'll just have to trek through it, won't we?" "Have patience, Castaneda." Silence followed. Coronado stared north beyond the sand and red hills. Castaneda tried to stare too. Then an obvious thought emerged. He waited for the right second, and when it came, Castaneda said the words quickly. "What about the Navy, sir?" "What about them?" said Coronado. "When do you think they'll arrive?" "They'll arrive. They'll come in their own time. Have patience, Castaneda." And with that, Coronado dismissed Castaneda and walked back to his tent. The sun broke away from the clouds, and the Spanish finally parked their main caravans and rested their weary souls near the banks of the river. All who were in Compostela that day were still present. They hacked and gathered wood from splints of desert trees and tall cacti, and as evening drew, the smoke from the burning wood rose and swirled in full clouds of blue and black. The women gathered their belongings and made a tent of their own, and the priests, Marcos, Luis, and the other clergy held a private baptismal ceremony and converted the native guides. But for the rest of the men, they took the rest for all it was worth. And with each passing day and night, they sat and laughed. They sang old songs and cursed each other to go to hell. But most of all, they gambled and drank. The rest was a much-needed distraction. We drank all day and well into night. Though after 2 whole days, I felt the rest had lasted too long, and later, I felt a tremendous unease about everything. There was much I remember about those nights. I remembered the music and the clinks of lutes and recorders, the plucks and charms of the guitars that brought them all to rhythm, and how they blended with the sounds of the drums and chants that came from the slaves and guides. So too, I remembered the dogs. I remembered them constantly barking. I remembered how hungry they looked. I remembered how they ripped and tore through the discarded bones that the Diaz brothers tossed to them. I remembered how they leapt on each other and slobbered and growled, and I remembered how they snarled and raced off into the dark. There was one dog in particular who came to my side many times. He was black and big with brown spots on his belly, and I patted his head every chance I could. They called the dog Satan. He was the sweetest dog I had ever met. His owner, Sanchez, was a stern businessman who didn't say much. Yet Satan himself had no quarrel spending time with strangers. And for those nights, I thoroughly enjoyed his company. But perhaps what I remembered most about these nights was gazing into Orchanga's eyes. They seemed so alluring. She was Bernardo's wife. She was the most beautiful woman I'd seen since I left Peru. My mind wandered into fancy, but I kept it secure in silence, and every time I glanced at Orchanga, she was still beautiful as I imagined her to be. I joined the men, and we went through jug after jug of wine. I sat by Julio. He was getting drunker by the second, and when he lifted his jug to his mouth, he missed completely. The other men were just as soused, and they toast to everything. To Satan. Isn't he a lovely dog? That he is. To those poor assholes in Seville. May they continue to be poor, misguided assholes. Fuck Seville! Fuck Seville! The toast continued, and we all took a swig. To that special woman of mine. What was her name? Maria! Maria! The toast languished on, and we all took a swig. And I heard a man slur to himself. Ah, Maria, Maria, Maria. Oh my God, she was beautiful. And I moved from fire to fire. The men, though, were too drunk to move. Most of them lay on the ground, as if dead men on a battlefield. Then I saw Brother Luis. He was with Bernardo and the Diaz brothers. I saw him silently stare into the fire, and I shook his hand. We talked for an hour. He was drunk, but he was cordial. And the more he drank, the more he told the truth. Tell me, Brother Luis, said Bernardo, what do you make of Marcos? He's a son of a bitch, said Luis. Well, that's telling, said Bernardo. Would you like to say anything else? That's all I will say about Fray Marcos. The men were still stunned by Luis's reply. As for Marcos, he stayed alone in his tent. No others dared to join him, and when they offered their company, Marcos barked at them like a dog. The men were afraid, but quite amused at the same time. I watched Marcos from afar and saw that he was in deep prayer. It was all too apparent that Marcos seemed not to possess a single friend in his life. He was too much with God. and it seemed his general problem. I kept my distance, but still, I wondered about him. Marcos was a fool, but he was our fool to follow. This rare little man, this golden opportunity. It was the only reason we were here. After the rest, we trailed north for another 3 days. Although I was glad we were back in motion, I felt a numbing pain. It was a pain I felt first in my feet, then in my neck, then to my stomach. And the pain lasted all day and well into the night. My mind raced with premonitions. I felt something terrible was about to happen. What it was, I hadn't the faintest idea. But in the air, I felt something desperately wrong. It was a certain looming reality. Then it happened. And in a single minute, the premonition became a clear, mundane, and horrifying fact. On a hunch, I checked on the wagon that carried our supplies and rations. I saw 3 bags of cured meat and nothing else. I confirmed the fact with all the Diaz brothers, Julio, and the others. But the worst part was that this was true of each and every unit. We were running out of food. Coronado finally received word and ordered a meeting with the captains the following night. After some deliberation, it was decided that each unit would scout a patrol to trade with any Pueblo Indian tribe in sight. The next morning came, and I ordered my unit to head south 2 miles. From there, we ran into a small tribe. The guides and translators committed to a peaceful negotiation. We traded necklaces and pieces of turquoise, and in return, we accepted corn. It was good corn, but it was all they had. We asked for more, but the tribe declined. Afterward, Coronado put Santaniello, the second in command, in charge of a barrage to find more food. 3 days had passed, and when the scouts returned, I noticed their faces. They were sad and glum, but I knew something else had happened. The men hammered a makeshift cross to the ground. Santaniello had been shot square in the neck with an arrow. The corpse was laid to its side, with the arrow still lodged in his neck. A mass was held. We stood and mourned. I looked at the men's faces. They remained appalled, frightened, and all too angry. Then I looked at Coronado and waited for him to give his next order. He remained in prayer. Up until then, the desert was only what it seemed to be, a unified blankness. Up until then, the expedition's charm took hold of us and seemingly would not let go. But as I stared at Santaniello's dull and blood-splattered face, that gaunt and pale and ghastly face of death, for a solitary second, I was taken back into the jungle, and I felt the same horror. When Coronado finished his prayer, he gave his orders, and I knew exactly what would happen. In the afternoon, we found the huts. 24 natives stood guard with bows in their hand. We heard them beat their drums and shout at us, seemingly begging for us to draw forward. I glanced over to the men. Many of the men had not known Santaniello, but it did not matter. They were enraged, and they wanted their pound of flesh. At dusk, we unleashed the dogs. It was a familiar sight, and I thought of Gonzalo Pizarro most of the time. The dogs tore into the archers, and the few who surrendered were gathered, strung by each limb, and tied to 2 opposing horses. And when the horses were struck, the natives' limbs catapulted up into the air. A crowd had formed by a tall cactus. They surrounded the accused, who turned out to be a native child. He was bleeding and crying. I watched the hangman place the noose on the child's head as the crowd cheered in delight. In my younger days, I would have stayed. In my younger days, I would have talked with the man next to me and compared this execution with a dozen others I had seen in my lifetime. But those days had passed me, and I left the crowd in disgust. When it was over, I found Brother Luis walking with his head hung low and sweat pouring down from his face. We stared at each other, but neither of us said a word.